On a world far removed from Earth, silence hung heavy inside the royal citadel. Whispers carried like blades, slicing through the air with the same cold precision as the judgment of her people. Their princess, descendant of warriors who had never once bowed to any invader, was trapped by a condition no blade, no ritual, no healer could undo. Her body, expected to carry the future of a dynasty, had betrayed her. What should have been a natural passage of life had sealed itself closed, turning what was private into a curse so visible it weighed on the empire itself. Her chambers became her prison. She walked with her head high, but her steps carried the weight of unspoken despair. The watchful eyes of courtiers judged every gesture, every breath, wondering if their legacy was already doomed. Alone, she clenched her fists until her nails broke skin, rage mixing with helplessness. She was bred to command armies, to strike fear into enemies, yet here she was, undone not by war, but by biology. The priests declared it punishment from the divine. The healers performed rituals, offered chants, even blood sacrifices, but the seal remained unbroken. None dared attempt the invasive remedies that might anger tradition, for failure would mean exile or death. Her people had strength enough to topple planets, yet not one of them would touch the unthinkable. They would rather watch her fade away than risk dishonor. But the whispers grew louder. In the dungeons below, a captive from Earth awaited his own end. A human, frail of frame, lacking the horns, the scales, the grandeur her kind revered. He had been caught in a skirmish, stripped of weapons, chained as a reminder of alien inferiority. Yet even in chains, one truth followed him. He was a medic. Not a surgeon, not a healer of noble temples, but a battlefield medic who had patched torn soldiers in the mud, who had fought death with his bare hands and desperation. The court raged at the suggestion. To allow this weak creature near the princess was sacrilege. To grant him access to the most private matter of royal flesh was unthinkable. But desperation erodes even the strongest pillars. If their princess died, their lineage would rot. If she lived and the humans succeeded, shame would follow, but at least she would breathe. The choice became survival versus pride. She sat in silence while warriors, priests, and healers argued like jackals. Their words no longer mattered. Each hour her body betrayed her further. Pain burned where it should not, and the weight of legacy grew heavier. For the first time, she lifted her voice, not as a ruler, but as a woman staring death in the face. She said she would accept the human's attempt, even if it meant disgrace. Better to gamble on life than to sink into slow decay. The chamber froze. The alien medics lowered their heads in shame. The generals muttered curses. But the order of a princess was absolute. The human would be summoned. His chains rattled as he was dragged upward from the darkness of his cell into the firelight of judgment. He looked nothing like a savior, clothed in rags, bruises still visible from interrogations. But his eyes did not drop when they met hers. Where her own people flinched, he held steady. He did not speak of gods or honor. He simply asked for tools and a chance. He did not promise victory, only effort. And in that moment, she saw something her mighty empire had forgotten, the will to act even in the shadow of failure. The decision was made. Life or death, hope or disgrace. Everything now balanced on a human who should have been nothing in their eyes. And yet, as the torches flickered against the stone, for the first time in weeks she allowed herself a single thought. Perhaps weakness was not what they had always believed. He had never imagined his fate would rest in the hands of enemies who despised him, yet here he stood, chains stripped away, thrust into a chamber where every eye measured his worth in silence. They expected weakness, hesitation, failure. He was no surgeon born to sterile halls, only a combat medic who had fought to keep soldiers alive with pressure bandages and grit when chaos swallowed the battlefield. But he knew the truth of flesh. Every body, no matter the shape, followed the same logic of life. To them he was fragile, but in his mind, fragility meant adaptability, and adaptability was survival. The debate thundered around him like war drums. Alien healers spat venom, claiming he lacked the knowledge of their anatomy, declaring the act blasphemy. Priests warned of divine wrath, generals of cultural collapse. Yet none offered a solution beyond waiting for her to die. The princess listened to the storm with her face carved from stone, her fate tossed like a pawn between voices too afraid to touch it. For all their fury, they were powerless, and powerlessness masquerading as pride tasted bitter to them. When silence fell, he stepped forward. His words were not grand, not wrapped in ritual or boasting. He spoke plainly, voice steady, explaining that he could try, that failure was certain if nothing was done, and that survival demanded risk. He reminded them he had seen men live from wounds no one believed survivable, not because of certainty, but because someone refused to give up. He offered nothing more than effort, and effort was more than they had shown her. The princess studied him with eyes sharpened by years of command. She saw his body thin and unimpressive, but she also saw no fear. Where her own warriors quivered under tradition, this human looked at her not as an untouchable idol, but as a patient who deserved help. That difference mattered. She declared she would accept his hand, not as trust in his strength, but as defiance against death. Better to risk disgrace alive than to rot away honored in memory. The chamber erupted in outrage. Healers shouted of sacrilege, warriors snarled that her name would be stained, priests muttered omens of doom. Yet her voice cut through their noise like a blade, through cloth. Her decision was law, and they could do nothing but obey. The human would be prepared. Guards delivered crude instruments, alien-forged tools meant for rituals rather than precise healing. To him they were inadequate, but he had worked with worse. On battlefields he had used belts for tourniquets, fire for sterilization, knives never meant for surgery. He examined the blades, clamps, and strange powders, his mind already racing, improvising. Fear whispered of the unknown differences in alien biology, but resolve drowned it out. He had lived too long with failure gnawing at him to walk away now. As he was readied, he spoke not to the court but to her. He told her the truth. The attempt could kill her, and if it failed, his life would be forfeit before his hands left her skin. Yet he promised that he would not stop until either life returned or his own blood stained the floor. She listened in silence, and for the first time, something softened in her expression, not trust, but recognition. The preparations ended in a silence heavier than iron. Priests whispered curses, guards sharpened blades, healers turned their faces away. But she stood tall, her choice unshaken. He stood opposite her, no longer the prisoner dragged in chains, but the only one willing to risk everything in the face of despair. For her people, this was madness. For him, it was simply the duty he had always carried. When life hangs by a thread, you hold the thread until your hands bleed. The torches dimmed, the chamber sealed, and all that remained was the sound of breath and the weight of expectation. The chamber closed in silence, heavy with the judgment of those waiting outside. He stood before her, instruments laid out like crude relics, each one unfamiliar, each one a poor substitute for what he needed. Yet hesitation was a luxury long beaten out of him on battlefields where seconds separated the living from the dead. He steadied his breath, recalling the rhythm of countless emergencies where improvisation was survival. Anatomy differed, but principles did not. Vessels carried blood, tissue carried pain, and every body wanted to live. He clung to that truth as his only compass. She lay rigid, eyes unblinking, allowing a stranger's hands where even her own people dared not go. Her silence was not fear, but iron discipline, the kind born from years of command. He spoke to her in low tones, guiding her through what he attempted, his voice less for explanation than to remind her she was not alone. In the flicker of her gaze, he caught the faintest acknowledgement, a bond forged not in trust but necessity. The first cut released more than blood. It released the weight of taboo. Crimson welled too quickly, spilling over the edges of his makeshift field. The guard shifted, hand on weapon, prepared to end him the instant life drained from her body. He ignored the threat. His hands worked with the speed of habit, pressing, clamping, cauterizing with heated metal. the air filled with the sharp sting of seared flesh. His heart pounded against his ribs, but his movements stayed steady, the memory of fallen soldiers sharpening his resolve. For a moment, it seemed failure was inevitable. The seal resisted every attempt to break it. Tissue knitted unnaturally, as if her body fought him with every breath. Sweat traced his temple, vision blurred, yet he refused to stop. He had lost too many on the battlefield to surrender now. He adjusted angles, improvised new pressure points, forcing his will against the stubborn lock of flesh. Pain rippled across her features, but she did not cry out. She endured as he pushed further into forbidden ground. Then the resistance gave way. What was fused, what was sealed by cruel chance, opened under his persistence. The flow corrected, the blockage undone. Blood steadied, breath deepened, and her chest rose with relief she had not felt in months. In that fragile instant, the line between survival and death tipped toward life. His hands trembled not with fear but with release, as though the weight of 100 battles had been lifted. He staggered, drained by the effort, every muscle screaming with exhaustion. She turned her gaze toward him, a silent recognition passing between them. He had crossed every line her people had sworn inviolate, yet she lived because he dared. The guard's hand eased from his weapon, uncertainty replacing fury. The silence stretched, carrying with it the undeniable truth. The human had succeeded where all others had failed. He collapsed to his knees, whispering only 2 words, "It's done." And in those words, both promise and defiance lingered, echoing through the sealed chamber where taboo had been broken and life reclaimed. The silence that followed was heavier than any battle drum. Outside the chamber, the court expected a corpse, whether hers or his. Instead, she emerged alive, her steps unsteady, but filled with a strength none could deny. Whispers erupted as eyes widened. The seal that doomed her had been undone, not by their priests, not by their healers, but by a human they had scorned as fragile. Shame clashed with awe, disbelief with relief. They searched for curses to hurl, but the truth stood before them breathing, undeniable. The healers protested first, declaring it blasphemy, claiming the act violated every sacred boundary. The generals sneered, insisting her survival was bought at the price of their honor. Yet the people saw what the leaders feared to admit. She lived. Hope had returned. The fear of a dynasty ending had lifted. Their pride cracked under the weight of undeniable life. Rumors spread like fire, of a human who succeeded where their greatest had failed, of hands steady under taboo, of courage unshaken when theirs faltered. She silenced the court with a single command. Standing before her people, she declared that her survival was not shame but proof of a greater truth, that strength was not measured only in muscle or tradition, but in the will to act when others shrink away. She spoke of the human's defiance, how he risked death not for glory, but for life itself. Her words cut deeper than any blade, striking at the heart of every warrior, every priest, every healer who had chosen fear over courage. The human stood nearby, not as a hero in his own eyes, but as a man exhausted, expecting execution. He had not come for honor, only to do what was right. Yet she lifted him beside her, naming him her savior before all. To some it was disgrace, to others revelation, but none could deny her authority. His fate shifted from condemned to spared, from prisoner to protector. He remained cautious, aware hatred still lingered, yet in her shadow, he was untouchable. Among her people, the story took root. Some whispered of weakness, others of danger, but many began to see humanity differently. The fragile creature had dared where they had not. The impossible had been made real by hands they had once chained. In time, the tale would spread beyond the palace, reshaping how her empire viewed those they once called lesser. For her, the moment was more than survival. It was transformation. She had faced death, humiliation, despair, and in her darkest hour, salvation came not from her own kind, but from one they dismissed. That truth could not be erased. And for him, the act was not about empires or legacies, but the same duty he had carried on every battlefield, to hold life together when everything else fell apart. In the end, the lesson was etched deeper than bloodlines or crowns. Sometimes the greatest strength is not found in the proud, but in the ones who refuse to let another suffer alone. It was a truth her people would never forget, a truth born from a human who risked everything to help.